If you'd like to open up your Bibles to Matthew chapter 7, that's where we're going to keep our Sermon on the Mount study going, and I think this is the last chapter of the Sermon on the Mount, so I'm not sure that it's an accurate thing to say we're 2/3 done. We'll move through this chapter pretty quick, but I was a little bit frustrated last week whenever I was doing this lesson. I got up and I walked into the kitchen, and Becky was sitting at the kitchen table. I said, let me tell you about what I'm working on. I'm doing Matthew chapter 7, and this is what it says. And she goes, so are you going to say what Jesus said, or are you going to say what you want to say? That's very offensive to be talked to that way by my own wife at my own kitchen table. I'm not going to pretend to be offended, though, because that's why I was going in there to talk with her, is because I was going to say I just had to throw an entire sermon away. I spent the whole first part of the week making a lesson on this text based on what I wanted to say and not what Jesus said. And so she was right, like normal, to accuse me in such a harsh way that always reminds me to be humble and small in all things. Let's read our text for this morning, Matthew chapter 7 and verses 1 through 5. I'm telling you, this has been really hard for me. The hardest thing about doing these lessons through the Sermon on the Mount has been to ignore as much as we can the rabbit trails and all of the yes buts, and to just stick with what Jesus says. And so as we read these 5 verses, maybe you don't do this. This is what my head is. This is where I'm programmed. I do this automatically. I read these verses, the very first one, judge not that you be not judged, and my mind immediately goes to, yeah, but there's sometimes that we have to do judgment. Don't do that now. Don't go to the yes but. Read the text for what it says. Let's hear what Jesus had to say to us when we do this text. Judge not that you be not judged, for with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when there is a big log in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. I think that it's probably clear enough that what Jesus is saying in this text, at least in the way that I understand it, there is one big point at the front of everything else, and that's don't be a hypocrite. The hypocrite theme is something that we've seen in the Sermon on the Mount. This should not be surprising to us. Back in chapter 6, in verse 1, we spent a lot of time on this idea of don't practice your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them. In verse 2, Jesus says, when you give to the needy, sound no trumpet before you as the hypocrites do in the synagogue. And the point is, don't do like the hypocrites. Do this yourself like you're supposed to do. In verse 5, when you pray, you must not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues. And he talks about how the hypocrites behave. In verse 16, when you fast, do not look gloomy like the hypocrites, for they disfigure their faces, and they do all of this. And so Jesus has been talking about hypocrisy up to this point. It should not jump out at us when we're reading through the illustration that makes his point when he finishes by saying, you hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye before you deal with the speck in somebody else's eye. Hypocrisy seems to be the straightforward point that Jesus is making here. I think that if we want to summarize this, maybe we would say something like this. You better make sure your own house is picked up before you start criticizing other people's house. Better make sure that your own life is straightened out and that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing and not doing what you're not supposed to be doing before you want to start pointing the finger, telling other people how they're supposed to live and what they're supposed to do and what they're not supposed to do. It seems like this is the overall point, and I'm just not really sure. And again, this is me. This is not me pointing the finger at you. I say this all the time. I am by nature a selfish person. When I prepare a lesson, I'm preparing the lesson based upon what I'm thinking and what works with me. I'm not thinking about you and all of that. I'm not sure that it would be the best use of our time in this lesson to look at verse 1 where it says, "Judge not that you be not judged," and then talk about all the things that we are supposed to judge. How about we spend our time this morning talking about what Jesus specifically said? And so that's the idea. There's about 5 examples that I want us to look at. Turn over to 2 Samuel chapter 12. One of the things that was a little bit surprising to me as I went through and put this material together is not any one of these stories. I know that all of these stories exist, and I know that there's a huge point that goes with each one of these stories. But to take all of these stories through the Bible and to put them together in one place really, really makes the point that God has had a lot to say about this subject. In chapter 12, in verse 1, this is Nathan the prophet coming to David after David has committed adultery with Bathsheba and conspired to have Bathsheba's husband Uriah killed. And he lived his life just like everything was fine. And Nathan comes to David to address this situation. And listen to what he says in verse 1. The Lord sent Nathan to David, and he came to him and said to him, "There were 2 men in a certain city, the one rich and the other poor. The rich man had very many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing but one little ewe lamb, which he bought, and he brought it up, and it grew up with him and with his children. It used to eat of his morsel and drink from his cup and lie in his arms, and it was like a daughter to him. Now there came a traveler to the rich man, and he was unwilling to take one of his own flock or herd to prepare for the guest who had come to him, but he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the man who had come to him. And David was angry. His anger was greatly kindled against the man. And he said to Nathan," here's the pinnacle of this story. This is David's response about this guy who took another man's sheep. "As the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die, and he shall restore the lamb 4-fold because he did this thing and because he had no pity." And Nathan said to David, "You are the man. You're the one. This story is about you and what you've done with Bathsheba and Uriah." And so Jesus' principle here from Matthew chapter 7 is that David has, with a giant log in his eye, that is something that corrupted his soul. It's something that corrupted his judgment, his entire life. The way that he ruled as a king was hindered because of this. With a giant log in his eye, was not able to rightly look at another person and say, "You took another person's sheep, you need to suffer this." Jesus would have said to David, "You need to work on yourself first. You've got a problem that you need to work out." And the thing that Jesus says in Matthew chapter 7 is, with the measure of judgment that you dole out to other people, that's the standard that's going to be used against you. And so when you think about what happened to David and David's story, because of his sin, Bathsheba's baby died. He lost a child because of it. That's on him. He's responsible for that. His son, Absalom, raped his daughter, Tamar. That's on him. The chaos in his family is happening in his family because Nathan said, "You're going to get 4-fold. The same thing that you issue out to other people, that's what's coming to you. He lost a child. Absalom raped Tamar. Absalom, his son, killed another one of his sons, Amnon. Can you imagine a parent? One of your kids kills another one of your kids. Absalom took all of David's wives publicly on the top of the palace for everybody to see. Nathan specifically told David, this is happening because you're willing to hand out this judgment, say you deserve death, you need to pay back fourfold. Nathan says to David, okay, if that's the standard that we're going to use, here we go, David. This is what happens to you now. And then eventually David's son Absalom, the guy who caused him so much grief and tried to take his kingdom away from him, Absalom himself died. It doesn't matter how rotten your kid becomes, they're still your kid. And David mourned over his son Absalom when he died. I think this is a story that might help us to appreciate this concept. Before you start going out telling other people that they're condemned to hell and that they're not able to be a Christian in their certain circumstances, you had better take a good long look at yourself first. Because that thing that you start saying to people, you're going to hell because that thing is also the standard by which you will be judged. And hell is the consequence. This is what Jesus is talking about here. Look at Romans 2. There's another example. Romans 2. All of this lesson, for the bulk of this lesson, this is all I want to do is look at, I think, 5 different places where we see this principle in action. I like the one in Romans chapter 2 because it actually points us back to the Sermon on the Mount and some of the stuff that we've already learned up to this point. I think we need to start in Romans chapter 1 and verse 18. And you need to put yourself in the shoes of a Jewish reader. Imagine that you are a Jewish reader, and this letter is coming to you where Paul, in Romans chapter 1, starting in verse 18, is condemning the Gentiles for all of the stupid apostasy that they thought would be a good idea, and the Jewish people are just wagging their heads thinking, unbelievable. Can you believe how ridiculous those Gentiles are? This is how it starts in verse 18. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all unrighteousness and ungodliness, and who by their unrighteousness they suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them. God has shown it to them. And we say, why can't they see that there's a God? How are they so blind that they can't understand the truth? And you flip the page, and Paul says, can you believe what they did? They worshiped the creature instead of the Creator. They made idols, and we're the Jewish audience, and we just say, oh, those Gentiles. I cannot believe how ridiculous those Gentiles are. And the next thing that he says in verse 26, for this reason God gave them up to dishonorable passions. Their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. And men likewise gave up natural relations with women. And sometimes we like to do this one too. And we look at the world and how wild things are getting and out of control. And we just say, I just can't believe how far gone everybody is. And he goes through the list. He comes down to verse 28. And they didn't acknowledge God, and so God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. And they were filled with all manner of unrighteousness. And you can hear, after every single one of these things, you can hear the Jewish audience going, psst, they're hissing. Oh, or they're cheering and they're yelling out. God gave them up to unrighteousness, no. Evil, no. Covetousness, no. And malice and envy and murder and strife. And we're just so irritated by these ridiculous Gentiles, sinful people who have turned on God. And then we cross over into chapter 2. And glad you agree with me. Therefore, you have no excuse, O man, every one of you who judges. For in passing judgment on another, you condemn yourself. Because you, the judge, practice the very same things. We know that the judgment of God rightly falls on those who practice such things. You are exactly right to condemn those Gentiles. We know it. We know that God judges people who practice these things. And he says in verse 3, do you suppose, O man, you who judge those who practice such things and yet do them yourself, that you will escape the judgment of God? We sit here when we read this book and we condemn and we hiss and we cheer and we boo at all of those ridiculous people out there. And what God is saying to us is, you better make sure you're not doing the same stuff. And then you've come over to verse 17. Look at verse 17. There's more on this one. He says, if you call yourself a Jew and rely on the law and boast in God, I might just change. I know I'm not allowed to change words in the Bible, but if we're going to apply this, we might just say, you who call yourself a Christian and rely on the law and boast in God, and you know his will and approve what is excellent because you are instructed from the law. We know what's right and wrong. If you are sure that you yourself are a guide to the blind and a light to those in darkness, this is what we're supposed to be. We're supposed to be the light of the world, to bring other people to the Lord and to teach them about right and wrong. He says, if this is you and you're sure, in verse 20, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of children, having in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth, you then who teach others, do you not teach yourself? While you preach against stealing, do you steal? You who say that one must not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who boast in the law dishonor God by breaking the law. For as it is written, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. And so Paul says to this group of Jewish listeners, you are condemning them out there for stealing because it's wrong, but you yourselves steal. And you can imagine at this point the Jewish audience, like the book of Malachi, saying, how do we steal? We don't steal. What are you talking about? I've not stolen anything. This is where we might go back to the Sermon on the Mount and what Jesus taught for this huge section, starting in chapter 5 and verse 20. I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter into the kingdom of heaven. And when we talked about that verse, what we said is, you need a righteousness of a different kind, of a different quality. What Jesus is saying to us, to his people, is that the righteousness that I expect from you is a righteousness of the heart. And so, yeah, we can point the finger and we can say, can you believe all of those violent murders out there? But Matthew chapter 5 and starting in verse 21 says, do you have anger and hatred in your heart? Do you call other people fool and all of these other things? Then you have the exact same problem. The comparison in Matthew chapter 7 and verse 2 is, with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. I should not have moved my finger. Back in Romans chapter 2, starting in verse 1, God said, in passing judgment on another, you condemn yourself, because you, the judge, practice the very same thing. This is what Matthew 7 is about. When Jesus says, judge not, lest you be judged. For the manner of judgment that we hand out to other people, that is the judgment that will be handed out to us. And the illustration paints the big point that Jesus is making here. How do you, with a giant log board coming out of your eye, you can see it's almost humorous. How do you think you're going to do surgery and taking out speck from somebody else's eye. The point is, you hypocrite, at the end of that text, you hypocrite, take the log out of your eye first. That's the big point. Look at John chapter 8. I think I'm behind. John chapter 8 is maybe one of the most famous, one of the most familiar ways that Jesus has made this point. I'm going to start reading in verse 3. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and placing her in the midst, they said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now, in the law of Moses, God commanded us to stone such a woman. So what do you say?" And they said this to test him, that they might have some charge to bring against him. And Jesus bent down and he wrote with his finger in the ground. And as they continued to ask him, "What are we going to do? We're supposed to kill her. What do you say, Jesus? Give us an answer. Are we going to stone her? Are we going to kill her right now?" Jesus answers their question. "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her." And once more he bent down and he wrote on the ground. And when they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the older ones, and Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. I think that we all realize, so this is one of those things that we all should realize. Jesus is not justifying the woman's behavior. He's not saying that what she did was okay, or righteous, or that she was able to keep on doing what she did. He wasn't justifying her behavior. And in fact, Jesus said in our Sermon on the Mount, he said, you're not allowed to take away anything from the law. The woman deserved what those Pharisees were accusing her of. Rightly, she did. And Jesus doesn't deny this. He's not saying, no, you know what? You're applying the scripture wrong. You're not quoting the right verse. She was wrong, and she deserved the punishment. But what Jesus is saying in John chapter 8 to these Pharisees is, you know what we need to do? Even more than this right now, we need to get your filthy heart cleaned up. Before you start condemning other people to death because of their sin, even within this text, it tells us that they had a filthy heart. In verse 6, they said this to test him. They didn't care about the woman. They didn't care about the law. They sure didn't care about Jesus. They just wanted to try and trick Jesus. And what Jesus is saying more than anything else is, you need to fix yourself. That's what we need to do right now. You need to get yourself under control. You need to get your heart right. Go to Galatians 5. There's another one. Are you surprised? Give me a head nod here. Maybe you're not. Maybe you're like, yeah, I know, this is a major biblical theme. Are you surprised that there's so much in the Bible about this? I mean, I went through and I was like, wow, how have I been able to deflect and dodge this conversation for so long without realizing that God has said so much about this? Look at Galatians chapter 5. This is maybe one of the worst chapter divisions in the entire Bible. Don't see chapter 5 and then stop and think, oh, chapter 6, new subject. The thought is going on through the chapter. And so we need to start in chapter 5 and verse 16, where Paul starts this conversation by saying, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. The desires of the flesh are against the Spirit, and the desires of the Spirit are against the flesh. For these are opposed to each other to keep you from doing the things that you want to do. And so this is where, starting in verse 19, Paul's going to say, don't do the works of the flesh. And he lists them all, this famous list of this is the works of the flesh: sexual immorality, impurity, sensuality. Don't do the works of the flesh. He says, walk by the Spirit, not by the flesh. Don't do the works of the flesh. And then starting in verse 22, he says, instead do this. This is the fruit of the Spirit. And so we're supposed to have the love and the joy and the peace and the patience. Don't do the flesh, do the Spirit. In verse 25, if we live by the Spirit, let us also keep in step with the Spirit. If we say that we live with the Spirit, then let us do the things that the Spirit does, which is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, and self-control, the things in the list here. If we live by the Spirit, let us keep in step with the Spirit. Let us not become conceited, provoking one another, envying one another. Ignore the chapter verse here. Brothers, if anyone is caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual. What's he mean when he says that? You see how the chapter division works against us here? You who are spiritual, you who've got this stuff worked out, or at least you're working on it right now, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, self-control. You who are spiritual, you who are walking by the Spirit, you who are producing the fruit of the Spirit, you who are spiritual, restore him in a spirit of gentleness. Keep watch on yourself, lest you too be tempted. Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. For if anyone thinks he's something, then he is nothing. He deceives himself. But let each one test his own work, and then his reason to boast will be in himself alone and not in his neighbor, for each one will have to bear his own load. Everything that Jesus says in Matthew chapter 7 is in this text that we just read right now. Jesus starts off by saying in Matthew chapter 7, judge not, lest you be judged, and take the log out of your own eye before you deal with the speck in somebody else's eye. And what Paul is saying here in Galatians chapter 5 and 6 is, here's what we're going to do when somebody among us falls. First of all, you who are spiritual are the ones under discussion. Now, this is a spot where we're probably going to struggle just a little bit. Because who wants to raise their hand and say, I'm the guy? But the concept here is the person to help the broken one is going to be the one who's got their own stuff figured out first. You who are spiritual, you who are the ones under discussion here, and you who are spiritual, as you go to this fallen brother or sister, to this one who is struggling with the works of the flesh, whatever they might have been up there, as you, spiritual person, go to this one, Paul says, I think 3, maybe 4 different times, don't be arrogant about it. Don't think for one second that you're better. Don't think for one second that you won't fall into the same transgression, into the same sin, into the same pattern of living. What he's saying is, make sure that you got your stuff straight first. And as you go to another person to deal with their stuff, you better do it in a humble way. Because I guarantee you there's something in your life too. I'm sorry, I think I'm behind again. Romans chapter 14. This is the last one. It's the last one on this point, but I'm almost ready to wrap this up. Romans chapter 14, starting in verse 1. I won't make a ton of comments about this text. We'll just read it. It's pretty straightforward. I don't think we need to keep doing this with every single one. Romans 14, starting in verse 1. As for the one who is weak in faith, welcome him, but not to quarrel over opinions. One person believes he may eat anything, while the weak person eats only vegetables. Let not the one who eats despise the one who abstains, and let not the one who abstains pass judgment on the one who eats, for God has welcomed him. Who are you to pass judgment on the servant of another? It is before his own master that he stands or falls, and he will be upheld, for the Lord is able to make him stand. Jump down to verses 10 through 13. This is ultimately Jesus' point here in saying, hey, just a real quick note about this, about passing judgment on other people. Let's remember that you're not the judge. Let's remember that on Judgment Day, you're not the one handing out eternal sentences of condemnation. Let's all of us remember this, starting in verse 10. Why do you pass judgment on your brother? Or you, why do you despise your brother? For we will all stand before the judgment seat of God, for it is written, as I live, says the Lord, every knee shall bow. I wonder if we should read it in this way. Every knee shall bow to me, not to you. Every knee shall bow to me, and every tongue shall confess to God. So then, each of us will give an account of himself to God. Therefore, let us not pass judgment on one another any longer, but rather decide never to put a stumbling block or hindrance in the way of a brother. So there's just like a handful of examples where Jesus has talked about this principle. And I know, I can guess. I shouldn't say that I know what's in your head right now. Maybe this would be true, and it wouldn't be surprising. Maybe you're just a leaps and bounds better person than me. Because at every single one of these texts, did anybody else feel the urge to say, but we have to say something? We have to. I mean, Jesus says, don't judge so that you will not be judged, and the measure of judgment that you hand out to someone else, that's what's going to be used against you. But we're called as God's people to speak God's truth to the world. We have to say something. And in my speaking God's word, I'm going to sometimes say things to people about their eternal destination that God has said, and they're going to say back to me, you shouldn't judge me. I'm going to say, you've misapplied. You've misapplied this verse. That's not what this verse is about. I have a friend named Matt Bassford who wrote on a Facebook post of mine. He said, just because some people misapply this verse does not release us from the burden of applying it. And the application is every single one of us had better make sure that our own house is cleaned up before we start judging other people for their dirty house. Because when we start judging other people for their dirty house, don't think for 1 second that God's going to let you off the hook and that you're not going to be judged for your own dirty house. It's a scary principle. This is a tough one for me, which I think might be a good place to finish as we think about the actual affirmative statement and what Jesus has said here. This would be a really good time for us to put an extra dose on mercy and forgiveness and what we hand out to other people, hoping very much to receive that back from God. This is the prayer that Jesus told us to pray in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 12. He said, this is what we say to God, forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors. And then we spent an entire lesson talking about 14 and 15. If you forgive others their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others their trespasses, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses. We talked about the unforgiving servant in Matthew chapter 18. Remember the guy who was forgiven a ton of debt and refused himself to forgive somebody else who had much less debt than he was forgiven. And the master comes back to that unforgiving servant and he says, oh, this is what we're doing. We're not forgiving people? All right, off to eternal condemnation for you. You're not willing to forgive? I'm not going to forgive you. You want to judge other people with a harsh standard or hold people up to an extreme standard? Brace yourself. Because that's the judgment and that's the standard that you ought to expect on Judgment Day for yourself. Not saying we shouldn't do it. There is a high standard. But brace yourself as you apply this standard to other people as the standard that's going to be applied to us. I might point you to Luke chapter 6 and to see how Luke himself applied this concept in this passage. When Luke talked about judge not that you be not judged, Luke did it in a context to emphasize the mercy and the grace and the forgiveness that God has given to us and that we're supposed to give to other people. It starts in verse 36. This is what he says, be merciful, even as your Father is merciful. The mercy that we show to others is the mercy that God will show to us. In verse 37, judge not, and you will not be judged. Condemn not, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you. That's our Five Guys French fries forgiveness that we're talking about right there. If we start handing out Five Guys French fries condemnation, I think it might be worth giving some extra thought to that. There's a book not in the Bible, shouldn't be in the Bible. It's Apocrypha. If you have like a Catholic Bible, it's in a Catholic Bible. It's called The Wisdom of Jesus ben Sirach, or maybe just Sirach. And there's a verse in Sirach that I love. And I think about it, and in this context, I think about it over and over and over again. Listen to this. Before judgment comes, examine yourself. And at the time of scrutiny, you will find forgiveness. Before judgment comes, before it's time to start judging another person, first examine yourself. And my guess is what you'll find is grace and mercy, the same amount of grace and mercy that you yourself need. Let's finish with our text. And then, I'm sorry, there's their verse from Sirach there. What Ryan has done for us this morning, we're going to finish the text. We'll offer an invitation, and then Ryan has chosen some songs to help focus our minds on the stuff that we've talked about this morning. I really like how he's done that. Judge not, that you be not judged. For with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when there is the log in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. If you're here this morning and you're not a Christian, it would be really important for me to say to you right now to consider your soul and to consider your eternal destination, not based upon my opinion, and not based upon what we teach as a church, but to open up the Bible and to see what God Himself has said about your condition. And what He has said also falls into this conversation. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Me and Mark and Jay and you. And the wages of that sin is death. That's eternal condemnation in hell. But Jesus has forgiven us, has given us a path to forgiveness, and that is to come to Him in faith, to confess Him before this group of witnesses. Jesus is King, and I'm going to serve Him, and I'm going to follow Him. To say, not in judgment or condemnation of others, but as a realization of your own self before God. It's time for me to die to myself and to my sin, to be buried under the waters of baptism. And when you come up out of that grave, to walk in newness of life as best you can, bringing others to the Lord's forgiveness. If we can help you with this today, come forward as together we stand and sing.
Jesus.